Well, hey everybody, thanks for dragging yourselves out from under the rock, blanket, comfort food, Xanax mountain that we've all been buried in since Tuesday, Jill and I included. It's nice to live in a place where I can just assume that 100% of people feel that way, right? Instead
Not Beverly Hills.
Well, I don't live in Beverly Hills, right? But that's an excellent point. There's a lot of plastic surgery over there that's on the wrong side of history, but at least we have each other. See, I made a little joke. That means life is coming back. It took me until Thursday morning to make a joke. Osceola was very happy. I made a little joke and he was like, "Oh, you're in there." And I was like, "I'm in there somewhere." But to bring it around and, to have this opportunity to reintroduce Jill Joy to the world. The space is, this is such a beautiful space. So obviously everyone's here. I don't think we need to go too deep into biography. We all, but we'll talk a little bit about yours. But I'm just saying, I think I've seen most of you in this space already during the opening, the other opening, and for those of you who don't know, I'll ask Jill in a minute to talk just a little, in her own words, since we have, about the sort of overall enterprise of the space, and then we'll come back and talk about the specific body of work, and then we'll take a minute and grab our chairs and go upstairs and speak with the two artists upstairs, as well as a little bit about how it sort of all hangs together and how that's going to work going forward. So we'll do all of that for the record. So hi, I'm Shana, everyone knows that, and everyone knows, or will soon know, Jill Joy of Jill Joy Gallery and Studio. And these are her paintings, and it's one body of work among several, and actually these are quite different from a lot of what will be seen going forward, and that's part of what's going to be interesting to talk about today as well. So I guess that's kind of the layout of the next hour or so, and before we jump into really looking at the work that we're sitting among right now, I want to ask Jill to maybe take a minute and just articulate for the camera and the record the inspiration behind opening the space and what this amazing motto about art and consciousness means to you in the context of what we're going to be looking at going forward.
So it came as a little bit of a surprise to me that I was going to end up opening a gallery. I kind of developed in my own little enclave, had a full-time job, painted on the side, and over the years it just kept taking up more and more time, energy, money, and had to let go of certain things to make space for it. And I am a very intuitive person. I have a really strong subconscious or soul, whatever you want to call it. And I kept having these dreams, like go to LA, go to LA. I'd been down in San Diego painting for about 10 years. Literally, Danny Dodge and Michael Hayden, who I both knew before I moved up here, came to me in my dream and they pointed north, So I thought, well, I guess maybe I'm better than I realize, or I should take myself more seriously than I am, because New York and LA, as far as I'm concerned, in this country are kind of it. And I thought I would just get a studio. And I'm well aware that I've always wanted to be in a major gallery. When I was in my 20s, I worked at the McKee Gallery, and just these lofty, sacred spaces, where these beautiful works by well-known, reputable artists hang. But I also knew I didn't have that path. I didn't have the BFA, the MFA, all the shows that you get. And I'm a certain age, and I'm a woman, and I thought, well, I'd love to have that happen for me, but I think the odds, if I'm realistic, are slim. It could, but it's a little bit like buying a lottery ticket, maybe with slightly better odds. So I thought, well, I'll move up to LA and I'll just open a studio that I can invite people in, just like a lot of artists do, right? And make myself a little more visible. And as I started looking for space, I looked in East Santa Fe Street, east of downtown, and Santa Fe Ave, I think it is, and And I just started migrating west because that's where I felt safe and comfortable, because LA was new to me and I had lived in Manhattan, and single woman, I wanted to be living and working where I felt secure. And then it just sort of evolved that I would just go all in, converted my retirement account through this way that you can do, it's called a BDRA, a business directed retirement account. My accountant likes having a heart attack because I already stopped working at a really great 6-figure job 4 years ago just to paint, and he's like, I'm his most interesting and insane client as far as he's concerned. And I decided to go all in, and I realized that it's very unconventional, especially in a contemporary art center. A Laguna Beach or a Scottsdale, maybe an artist will open a gallery. But the truth of the matter is, I wanted the experience of being able to share my work without this tight funnel. Because even if you get in a gallery, usually they'll show one body of your work, right? They need to have a visual.
They'll show one body of your work once every 12 to 18 months.
Right, if you're lucky.
And that's the best case scenario.
That's the best case scenario. And then all the people walking and interacting with your work, you're not there except at the opening. And as Shana alluded, I paint now, I have a large body of early work where I transition through a lot of styles. And a lot of it's good, I think, and has never been shown. So there's that piece, which I know we all have, right? And some of it you sold, and some of it you stored, and some of it you've given away. But then concurrently, I work on 3 bodies of work. This is Emotion, which I started in 2008. And then as I kind of cleared my psyche of a lot of my internal struggles, and I moved towards a series in 2011 called Consciousness, which is the first show that I had over on Wilshire that a number of you have seen. And then most recently, since I think it was after I started painting full time, after I left my corporate job, probably the first painting was in 2014, Illumination, which will come up in February. So I want to paint what I want to paint. I want to share it with the public as long as they want to see it and as long as I can afford to do it. And then to whatever extent I can, I want to be able to bring in artists who haven't really been accepted or welcomed in the system, or not yet, So I think there's a lot of very high quality mid-career artists who, aren't being shown the way that they could be.
Right, who are in your identical empathetic position, but
Right.
without whatever extra crazy gene it takes to decide to open a space.
Yeah, so especially at this stage in my life.
But I mean, in a way, it's, more than perfect. I mean, I don't know if we've talked about this, but just fun fact, I went to college with Gavin McKee.
Oh my, we did. I think we might have.
Okay, the son
Gavin.
of McKee Gallery, which by the way is now closed.
Right.
So for better, I don't know if that's for better or worse,
That's
but it's
weird.
like even if you had achieved your dream of showing with McKee Gallery, your gallery just closed.
Well, in theory,
Right,
but,
so I mean,
yeah.
the world is changing too, which
That's
in
true.
my opinion is just another case for doing whatever you feel moved to do, because you don't have the sense of permanence of the institutions in the art world anymore, sort of anyway. So that little voice of why not is becoming a louder and louder voice of why not, because the things that you're comparing yourself to are losing traction. Gavin's dad is not the only amazing, American gallery institution to have closed in the last couple of years. And so, there is something about that system that seems to be deteriorating, which not everyone thinks is a terrible thing. And so, that kind of little hints of untethering, I think, even make a stronger case for sort of doing something independent, especially if it's meaningful to you as an artist. So it's kind of like this irony that the thing that makes less sense starts to make more sense
Right.
as things change, right? So it's kind of like, don't worry about it. You know what I mean? Even more so.
Yeah.
And I think it's funny that these, or funny meaning remarkable, not haha, that these paintings are from 2008, because at the time you did them, that was a personal, there's a lot of personal matter happening in these works for you, which is something that is traditionally associated with the sort of abstract expressionist genre, as this kind of idea that it's not always 100% accurate. There's a lot of stylistic and art historical choices that go into working this way as well, but there is this idea that work that is in this sort of abstract and expressionist model, even if it's not ab-ex, is something that's tied into a sort of direct expression of personal emotion. Usually, we talked a little bit about this a minute ago, but usually I think that we happen to almost always associate working that way with something that's complex at most, but is more often than not described as more like it's a meditative thing, or it's an organic thing, or it has a beauty, a harmony, and lacking an actual beauty, a balance. And that we think of abstract expressionism, the way it's evolved in contemporary art history, as something that is still kind of striving towards a type of beauty that is kind of like the natural world, right? Like that's kind of the end of the spectrum that I think most people inhabit as a general matter when we're talking about expressionist work. And I think that there's something really moving and sort of poetic in the fact that we are now having another sort of political crisis with a lot of personal ramifications. It's a different thing, but in 2008 it was like, it wasn't just, the stock market crashed. It was like the stock market crashed and everyone lost everything. And so it was this national tragedy made up of several million individual tragedies. And I think that it's not a perfect match, but I think that what we're all sort of grieving for this week is another time when a political upheaval is made up of a lot of very individually dark experiences. So for example, we were talking about this before, we were all super pissed when George Bush beat Al Gore, but nobody cried for a week. Do you know what I mean? This time it feels different because our friends and our neighbors, and because we are watching the racism and the misogyny and the fascism and the anti-American, the betrayal of our American ideals, and what kind of left-wing liberal talks like that betrayal of America. And all of a sudden our the hippiest among us are defending the Constitution. It's so weird, right? So, but I also think that we are feeling something that is a lot more like personal grief in this political season than in other political seasons that were disappointing but sort of normally disappointing. This is abnormally disappointing. And so 2 weeks ago when we were starting to talk about having this, I was like, gosh, the emotional content is so personal. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to make you tell any TMI of that, and that's not what we're here to do. But I think it's ironically become work of such a raw emotional quality that now we kind of all have access to this unresolved violent emotion, that there's some elements of fear and unknowability in this work, and that there's literally, if you look at the titles, what's in this man, what's in his heart, or you know what I mean? It's
his confused heart.
His confused heart, or the one behind me, death comes and recedes.
Or she's come undone, which
she's come undone.
The whole country right
now. And so maybe you made these as intensely personal works, 8 years ago. But I think right now there's so much room for how a lot of us are feeling in this work, even though I really don't want to talk about Trump, but it's sort of literally the elephant in the room. I'm super sorry, but Republican, it's an elephant. Yeah. But here we are. And so I almost feel like this work has been darkly gifted with a whole new set of entry points for your audience. Because for whatever combination, the emotions that are in this work are now emotions that we all have this collective access to. So that's a lengthy, and I'm kind of figuring it out right now, because that only occurred to me once my brain started working again, like Thursday afternoon. But I realized, oh my God, we have to do this talk, and who cares about art? And then I was like, oh, we care about art more than ever. Oh wait, these effed up, raw, grab you by the heart, rip them out of your chest paintings is kind of how I feel. Maybe it's good to come and be able to have that conversation. So it's a different talk than it was going to be.
Absolutely.
When we put it on the calendar.
Yeah.
But sort of here we are. And so I guess buried in that mound of preamble is my question to you as the artist, as the person who created these for one reason, now being thrust into a situation where you're looking at your own work with a whole new set of filters, and maybe talk a little bit about what that is like for you. And that will help us look at maybe a couple of the individual or moments in some of the work, and,
Sure.
and that'll be.
So first, just a point of clarification. I started this series in 2008, and these run all the way up to 2015. So I don't do a lot of these every year.
That's a good point, that the three you mentioned, emotion, consciousness, and illumination, are all ongoing always.
All ongoing, yeah. And really they reflect my own personal process of dealing with my life, processing it, and taking myself to the next level. And I think what's so, I originally had planned to hang Consciousness this month, but I was kind of exhausted and trying to organize Aileen and Michael's show, and I was like, you know what, I'm gonna leave this work up another month, just take a breather. And then when this all happened, and I started to feel like this again, just a tremendous sense of betrayal and hurt and frustration and surprise, that I thought, as a nation, we'd come so far in the last 8 years, I thought, for caring for each other and, healthcare and compassion. Surprise.
Right.
And so I think what it is for me as an artist, and even just a person who's willing to explore her emotions, is it just validates the process. We all now have to go through grief and anger and upset and feel it, and then transform it and decide, what are we going to do with it? Are we going to become bitter and withdraw from the system, or start to hate the people who hate the people? Or are we going to transform ourselves so that in 4 or 8 years we're further along than we are now? And that's kind of literally the process of these paintings, is just me doing that personally with my own life. Like, that painting came out of me letting go of a really high-paying corporate job, a beautiful condo that I sold to help fund this thing, a relationship I had to let go of because it just required way too much commitment of my time and energy. And it's called dissolution. And it was a way of me processing the grief of letting go of an entire way of life in the hopes that I could create a more authentic life. Mm-hmm. And these periods of trial are what they do allow us to do that if we work them consciously and actively. And I'm kind of astonished that this is the first time I've experienced this type of emotion that didn't come from my personal life.
Yeah.
I was never that upset in previous elections, 9/11 came close, but I really wasn't at this space then. I wasn't doing this kind of work. I was, not as much of a painter at that time. But this is the first time I feel a shared sense of grief and betrayal and, all the things that I think a lot of us are going through.
Yeah, and so I find that just very, as a sort of art critic and art nerd, I find it absolutely endlessly fascinating that work that might have been created from a specific personal nature without iconography can still, can be accessed by strangers with no information about what made you do it, separated by a period of years. That somebody can look at that painting right now and think, I know how that feels, exactly from what you said, with or without a personal experience in their life. It maybe used to be that the emotion would be universal, but in that sort of like, we all know what it means to lose someone we love kind of way. Like Karen Davis's show at Wild and Cran is closing today, and that entire show was about how she processed her husband's sudden but not unexpected, because he had been sick, Noah, death. And, you know, that's something that is very specific but kind of very universal, because that's like someone you love died. Okay, we all know what that is. But, you know, that there's a narrative attached to that, and so you kind of have a way in. And for completely sort of abstract, non-objective work that just is speaking that subliminal language, to also be able to access other people's emotional, makeups and memories, and then on top of it to have this layer of that being reversed, where it's the cause is something, there's an external cause that can be identified. These events, you know, evoked these emotions in me. Then we all are experiencing them at once. And so then you wind up back at this place where, exactly what you said, that it proves the worth of the process. In other words, that undertaking to kind of find through the act of making this work, that place, that universal place in you, it stands up not only, over time, although granted a short period of time and some of the work is less than a year old, but that idea of it's sort of like it's the promise of abstraction when it was sort of codified. I won't say invented, because that's kind of silly, but you know, the idea of people in the early part of the 20th century looking at abstraction, and you think of something like some of the design movements like De Stijl or whatever, where the idea was that you take out imagery and you get to somewhere that's abstract, and that would actually be more universally accessible to people in the absence of encoded, you know, imagery and language and text. And so that if it was more pure in its intentions, it wound up kind of having the opposite effect, where it actually became kind of rarefied, and you kind of had to learn about it and become, you know, that's a whole other tangent of art history. But I think that, you know, this really is kind of like the promise of what abstract expressionism always stated that it was about being, which is, you know, bypassing specific narrative and going straight to a more liminal connection between people's experience, you know, based on universal kinds of experiences. So even though that's happening in the context of something somewhat awful, I think it is a really lovely thing to note, that is exactly how this work, you know, is functioning, right? So I have a specific question about one of the pieces for you. This one here, His Confused Heart. Well, this one is...
That one's His Confused Heart.
And that one is
Do You Love Me?
Do You Love Me? So only after I read the title again did I realize that there is in fact a giant question mark in the middle of the work. Mm-hmm. Because in the absence of knowing that it's titled in the form of a question, that, you know, you might just read that as a sweeping, multiply, a heavy brush stroke, and that exists elsewhere in work, you know, in your work. But knowing that belongs to a question, I thought, okay, I like that, right? That's text, I guess, for lack of a better way of differentiating it. So then that actually made me wonder, are there the degree of intention that you approach some of these canvases with in that sense? So like, I'm looking at that, that horizontal streak of red seems very like a sports car bullet train racing away to me, but I could just be, reading that into it. It's also just a gorgeous, piece of brushwork, very thick. So my question is, this one seems to be obscuring, something that maybe is behind it, with the sort of blizzard whiteout conditions over the top of it. So my question is, when you started these paintings, these really raw, deliberately emotional paintings, do you have those kinds of issues in mind? Do you start with imagery and then obscure or obliterate it? Are there images and objects and things like that buried under there. Like, what's that for you in terms of then like how the title might be expressive of something that's under there but we can't see it anymore?
So it depends on the painting. So these two on the right were pretty much completed in one sitting. Pretty much, I have kind of a strong inner eye or something. I don't know what you call it, but when I'm just not asleep, but just relaxing, or usually right before I fall asleep, sometimes a painting will just boom, it'll show up in my mind's eye. And it's usually a reflection of my emotional experience. So I expect to, I've started seeing these again. And I haven't seen one of these since I lost the space on Wilshire. So it depends, like that question mark, I can't actually remember as I was making it whether it was literally just that feeling of I don't know. I really just don't know. It's almost kind of how I feel now with what's going to happen in the future with this president. And, to me he's like...
He's not president yet.
President-elect. To me he's kind
totally
of like the, he's kind of like the bad, he's like the bad...
I have 2 months, okay? Don't take it away from
me. he's kind of like the bad daddy. You know? Like,
no, not kinda.
Yeah, but I mean like metaphorically.
And literally.
Because here's
an overused word that is
our
appropriate.
Authority figure, and for the last 8 years we've actually had a male authority figure in power that I could look up to, respect, even want to emulate. I mean, this guy is just, classy and smart and measured. And so, this speaks to a personal love relationship, but it goes back to, that relationship is based on the relationship with my father, who, I didn't really grow up with. So I'm there all over again. It's like all these people that he hates, when really we all just want to be accepted, for who we are. So to answer your question, sometimes they come fully formed. These were completed over a longer period of time, and yes, there are underpaintings. One of those was completed. There's an entirely different painting under there that I was not able to finish. I still had my corporate job. I was painting out of my loft, living in my loft. Someone had turned me on to this great petroleum-based medium. Painting was taking over my life. I moved something out to dry on the balcony, and I slashed my, off-white couch, that was not intended to be a studio couch. Anyhow, long story short, I got sick because I was breathing all this stuff. And I also realized, I'm like, I gotta change my life, painting can't just be an aside. If I'm gonna paint like this, I can't be living with this. And it started the process of me, leaving my job and doing this full time.
And so the painting you were in the middle of, you just
I got
abandoned,
sick, so I
you
stopped.
changed, everything changed.
Yeah. Got them to lay me off, rented a big studio, flipped this thing on its side, and just processed the loss of that life and the start of a new one. So it kind of depends. This one went through, it was a similar process where I had one idea of how things should be, and it was sort of idealized, and probably could have left it as a painting, but this sort of out of control sense of surrender that ended up with this painting was just a reflection of the process. So some of them are like very much, they come to me, boom, they're done, and then some of them are a little bit more of a process.
Right, because for example, these two have, I would say out of all of them, the most like overt thing you could call imagery.
Right.
There's the question mark, and there's this, which, is clearly, but I mean, I think a lot of people would read it as a sort of ripped open rib cage, open heart surgery kind of situation, like imagery as well as how it feels. And of course the title, even further reinforces that. They're all really well titled in that way. I think marginal note for just art history, I think it's not cool to be both abstract and say everything's untitled. I think give me a picture or give me some words. Like it's lazy. But anyway, so I love you for that because
Thank
it's
you.
kind of like
Nice to
give
hear.
me like 5%, like 1 iota, some kind of story, some way in which I could maybe I can reject, but I mean something. Anyway, that's just me. Maybe it's not just me. But I love your titles because I feel like, especially in the abstract realm, the viewer can get there, especially when they're articulate, emotionally. The viewer can follow you there, And a title, maybe less than directing them, like validates where they already got themselves. So you see a painting, you have a reaction, you go up to the wall, you read what it says, and you go, yeah, that's what I was, And I think that is a really, welcoming, empathetic, compassionate stance towards your audience as an artist. So I always appreciate it when when that happens. Especially when it's like just enough information that it can set you off down the road towards it, but you plenty room for your own experience to fill in the details. So we all have a his that can go where his confused heart goes. It's like whoever you got. Don't worry about whoever yours
Could be
is.
her too.
Could be her. So I really like it could be mankind's. It could be anybody's. So
Could be
but you are talking about right exactly. So that's always I think really just a really helpful stance, especially in light of you talking about it being so important to you to be in a sharing kind of dialogue with your audience, and the reasons why being in a studio it's all that, but it's harder to get people through. Being in a gallery, easy to get people through, harder to have that encounter, that kind of encounter with them. And so something like this that's almost like a hybrid of those two, I can see why that would appeal to you personally, and why that would appeal to to people in the art world who also lament those kinds of distances that the system can put up. So, I think in a way these paintings, as rough and almost difficult as they are, I think kind of wind up being something like perfect for our time right now, which I know is hard to even take as a compliment, but I really do mean it that way.
Surprise. I mean, I feel like it kind of, I just feel like it validates what I'm doing. I mean, I think we as artists, we all think what we're doing is important, right? I mean, once you get down to it, we all have our doubts, and we have our fears, and sometimes we feel competitive or neglected, and sometimes validated. But you wouldn't be spending all the time, money, and effort, unless you felt it was important. But in the back of your mind, you still wonder, well, is it? And so I guess when you do something, and this is on the macro where it's like, holy crap, like this looks like fascism to me today,
Yeah.
And it's really a painting about my relationship with my mom,
It
But
can be both.
Today it looks like a pretty scary, questionable situation that I believe will work out all right,
Right. Some people have that relationship with their mothers.
Well, there was a bit of that, perhaps.
I don't know. I don't. Mine's lovely, but I'm just telling you.
So.
But that's kind of what I mean. Like, it's funny, but it's also true. And I think, that's, some of the best art that has been made in the history of making art is the kind, I'm a fan of work that can exist on both the micro and the macro levels that way. I think it needs to, and it's a hard trick.
And that's part of, I think this is a good segue also to just talk about
Definitely.
why I invited Aileen and Michael to show here is, to me, that is sort of the definition of a spiritual existence. We have the physical world, our relationships, our body, politics, the economy, all this stuff that happens, and then we have this inner world. And I would argue that Donald Trump, being president-elect, has revealed some very deep, unaddressed wounds and divisions in this country.
Yeah.
The same way that a personal crisis, like an illness or a divorce or a bankruptcy or job loss or something, might reveal. And part of what I saw in Michael and Aileen's work, whether they intended it or not, or more or less, very strictly their work's about the physical environment and the elements of the environment. But to me, I felt sort of this inherent mystical sense to the work that they're doing, that it produces an emotional experience that transcends that, and yet they're using the natural physical elements. I'm using paint, and movement and color, and these guys are using, Aileen specifically using imagery and texture, and Michael has the plants and the surfaces that are, dug out and then sublimely, that's the tie-in, you know.
Yeah.
It's the inner world and it's the outer world. So here's my inner world, and unfortunately at the moment, you may be feeling this as, you know, reflecting our outer world. But
Like, unfortunately.
but for me,
Sorry, you're all in my inner world now.
you're in my inner
Sorry, you
world.
guys.
Sorry to do that to you, but there is an inherent message of hope in my work and inner strength and the courage to feel the grief and cry and go scream in the streets or whatever you need to do, and then be like, okay, now what do we do? How do we figure out how to bring these people along who feel left behind, and how do we move forward from here?
They want them, they can have them. I mean,
It's
yeah,
my-
totally,
it's my
definitely.
message, not
Let's heal.
necessarily
Let's heal. I signed the secession petition, but that's me. I don't expect you
Hey,
to.
there is a time for secession, and
Yeah,
there's a time
2019.
for reconciliation.
Yeah.
I'm not saying we're there yet. Reconciliation.
No. But I mean,
Not
you know,
even
not
close.
for nothing, but it's, you know, it's also, there's a whole other set of language, and then we'll wrap up, and everyone grab your chair.
Yeah, we're gonna go upstairs.
And go upstairs, and we'll reconvene with the two of them. But I just want to say, there's a word for a lot of, you know, this, which is process painting, and I always really like it when there's a whole secondary but totally salient meaning behind a term like that. So it's a formal term, meaning that elements of the process are left visible in the finished object or composition, that, you know, the scars of its making are visible in the content at the end. And, you know, this kind of work definitely has that, but it's also very much about seeing one's emotional profile as a process as well, something that evolves. And just to tie it back in, that's why the word, you know, this sort of almost palindrome of art evolves consciousness, consciousness evolves art. It's like, it doesn't almost matter what's first. You have an idea and then express it. Is the unknowing expression what codifies or articulates the idea on the other side of the painting? It doesn't matter. It's a circle, and it's all in this process. And then the work itself, you know, has the proof of how it was made in the process. So for me as a writer, like, that's a really beautiful kind of little bow of how it all really hangs together with, you know, this kind of purpose. And hopefully when we come back and have this conversation in January about consciousness, we'll all be feeling a lot better.
We're feeling a lot better.
Right, we look forward to that. It's sometime in January.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember.
I forget what we
date.
said.
I think we said the 21st, but I don't want
That's
to go down
Inauguration
on-
Day, good
on
Christ.
stuff. Is it really?
If it is, I hadn't even, no wonder I blocked it
Is
out.
that a Saturday?
TBD.
TBD.
Friday the 20th. So apparently we've scheduled our next talk for the day after. We might want to have a look at
We
that.
might review that.
TBD. Let's go with TBD for now, because honestly,
take a pulse of the nation.
I might be
before
like,
we reschedule.
yeah, I might be in rehab somewhere on the 21st. So sometime in January. All right.